Mic check testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Audio check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Will members of the Executive Committee please report to Committee Room 1 for quorum?
I be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What? Councillor Pasternak, I won't even ask. I won't even ask. I'm sure you were. All right. Yes, I'm quite happy to entertain some quick releases if there are some. Councillor Thompson, did you have one?
I have one, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Councillor Shiner's holding it already. EX 3511, Invest Toronto Annual General Meeting, and 2017 audited financial statement. Contrary to some views, Invest Toronto has not died, but we are moving it forward. And I have a motion, if we ask staff to put it on the screen. The motion is essentially that we retain all of the logos, slogans, domain names, and so on, so we could utilize that name if we so choose sometime in the future. Staff and everyone is in concurrence. That's it.
I think it's a very prudent thing to do. Are there any questions of the mover or any remarks to be made? Anything else? All right, well then we have the amendment proposed by Councillor Thompson. I'll call the question on that. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. And then on the item as amended, item 35.11. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Other quick releases. I don't know if people want it. I had, let me just find my little piece of paper here. There it is. I had, on 35.26, as you know, on dealing with the surplus, it is basically allocated pursuant to an existing city policy, and staff recommend pursuant to that policy. And the motion that I had, and if it's going to take a long time, I'll deal with it in order, but otherwise I had this motion that was previously circulated to you, which I have here somewhere, that dealt with authorizing, here it is here, it has advanced circulation on it. It's a motion on 35.26 authorizing up to $13 million in additional funding for the Vision Zero over and above the $21.3 million already budgeted. And it would be from the Capital Financing Reserve, which we will have just replenished with a very substantial amount of money, way in excess of this. I'm pleased to tell you that you know, the reserves, which were the subject of some discussion at budget time, will be very handsomely replenished and then some as a result of this surplus and the council's policy. But I'm happy to sort of deal with that item now, unless people had lots. There was no other. Did other people wish to ask questions or speak about the variance? Because if so, we can just put it down. No? Well then, if we can deal with that as a quick release, I will move this amendment and just say that I think that the allocation of these additional funds in light of the financial position in which we find ourselves, but also in light of, in particular, the urgency of getting on with as much as we can, as fast as we can, in effective measures to address road safety for cyclists, pedestrians, and everybody else using the roads, is something that I think is a very appropriate use of these resources up to this amount. And we spelled out what those things would be that could be done faster and better if we had this money available now in 2018. So I would say nothing more than that. Did you have a question of the mover?
speak just briefly?
Oh, sure.
Seeing as the issue of Vision Zero is in front of us, Mayor Tory. Funny, because I think in Toronto, most of our streets are two ways, and so is road safety. So when it comes to the concerns that have been expressed, and I'm very sorry to see any type of tragedy happen in the city, in particular when someone may be struck or killed or injured in an accident. It is a two-way street if you want to travel by bicycle, if you want to walk in the city, if you want to drive in the city. And I'll tell you, I wish I had a dash cam on my car when I drove down in the morning down Bay Street. Yes, I drove down. The number of people that crossed mid-block, stood in the middle of the road, the bikes that veered around the cars that were there, that crossed in front of you or mid-block, and the drivers that pulled out without signaling. There is an issue out there with people not acting properly on our streets, whether they're crossing, whether they're driving, whether they're riding. And until we all get a better handle on that, it's unfortunate, but we're going to continue to see accidents happen out there and tragedies happen. So it is a two-way street, and money from the city on a strategy that we have to try and help won't help unless the people that are out on the streets help themselves. Stop crossing mid-block in dangerous locations and dodging traffic, running across the road. A gentleman ran across the road today so he could get in front of the cars that were coming down on Bay Street with heavy traffic moving down because there was no gap. And if he tripped, someone would have hit him, and then something would have happened, and both the driver and would have possibly caused a concern to him, because no one wants to injure anyone, and the pedestrian down there, and the cyclists that just drop out. You stop just north of the city here on Bay Street, the pedestrian light to cross south of Dundas here, so pedestrians can cross. It's amazing. Cars stop, some cyclists stop, and some cyclists go right through and almost hit the pedestrians. The rules are for everyone to obey on the road, and unless people are more cautious around this city, there is no amount of money that we can throw at it that'll fix the problem if people don't try to fix the problem themselves.
Thank you, Councillor Shiner. And may I just say, Councillor McMahon, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I just, I wasn't going to, but after that comment, I'm just going to say that, yes, everyone should pay more attention. People who walk and people who bike and people who take transit, and also people who drive need to pay more attention and be mindful that they are behind a one-ton metal box that is more powerful than handlebars or your feet. So I don't want to get into he said, she said, and finger pointing. We all need to be more mindful and all share the road appropriately.
That's what I said. I said including drivers.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson?
Well, I want to thank the Mayor for this increased investment in this important program, and this will allow us to yet again accelerate this, which we've done multiple times. I mean, we did it in 2016 before the program even started. The 5-year plan was to commence in 2017, so we were able to accelerate it in 2016. We accelerated it in 2017 thanks to Council supporting that, and we've accelerated it again. And we're accelerating our community safety zones as per our last Public Works meeting. So this increased investment is very important, and it does allow us to fast track and streamline the work and accelerate the initiatives and the countermeasures. I would also just quickly say that what still bothers me is we're not actually fully reflecting the amount of money we're spending on this, because it's way above actually $100 million. Because we're not, as New York and other major cities across the world are doing, is they're actually also tabulating or calculating the full amount with their cycling network, their road repairs that have a road safety lens. And so this is actually pure allocated money to just Vision Zero staffing and resources, whereas other cities are really reflecting a much, they look like they have a bigger number, a bigger allocation, because they're actually doing it in a broader way. So I hope at some point Mr. Mayor, that transportation will actually give us that number. They did a couple years ago, but I'd like to see it updated, and all the investments throughout transportation and possibly other divisions that are being dedicated to this initiative, so that we have that comprehensive number before us, and the residents of the city see how committed we are to this initiative and rolling it out as effectively and efficiently as possible. But thank you for this. This is
Thank you,
terrific.
Councillor Robinson. Thank you for all your work on this too. Anybody else who wants to speak? Councillor Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong.
Just very briefly, I will agree to the extent to Councillor Shiner's comments. I would say that money is not going to solve this problem alone, singularly, and I think what I took from Councillor Shiner and what I 100% agree with are two ideas. One is a shared responsibility from all road users. I think that's what he was talking about. And I think the other piece is personal responsibility. So when you enter the street, we all have personal responsibility to conduct ourselves in a safe way and to be aware of our surroundings. And I think there's a certain level of understanding, a certain level of frustration when it's felt that certain road users don't have that same responsibility, notwithstanding that they're a different type of user. And the second thing I will say is, you know, within this context, I don't think street festivals are going to solve this problem, and I don't think a one-size-fits-all solution where we're going to reduce speed limits across the entire city is going to solve this problem either. We have to have a careful approach, and I'm pleased to support this motion to provide more money in this particular on this particular initiative.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I agree with the comments that have been made so far. I just wanted to lend my voice to this, but particularly I just wanted to say I think an area that we seem to be failing with respect to communications, communication education, if you will. The PSAs, for example, where we get everyone thinking and being attuned and aware. There are a lot of shared responsibilities, and I guess blame can be tossed around and so on, but I guess the point is that at lunchtime I received a telephone call from a resident in my ward. She's a senior. She crossed over to Highland Farms to walk over back to Y Valley, and she was talking about a cyclist and a car, the occurrence that almost occurred, and both seemed to not be paying attention. And she was alarmed, obviously, she made it known to me, about the issues that she's hearing in the media, people being killed, people being injured, and so on. And we talked a little bit about the fact that not enough is being done as it relates to just simply public announcement, helping people to be aware. And so, as been stated, that it's about shared responsibility. It is, actually, because, you know, whether or not it's the fault of whoever, it's an issue where all of us are concerned when a fatality or an occurrence occur. And I don't call them accidents anymore because they can be prevented in a large way, but it ensures and requires us all to be paying attention. Councillor Sharon talked about his Bay Street experience. I had a Bay Street experience last week, which just basically almost left my heart leaving my body because a person riding a bike, not doing it responsibly, just basically darting out in the middle of my vehicle. And I was actually in the middle lane, and they were initially in the far right-hand lane, but they wanted to get through the traffic. And then they rode down the center yellow line going north on Bay Street towards Richmond. All the vehicles are coming. Now, that's not a bike lane the last time I checked. And in fact, it was a very dangerous exercise for that person, and things could have happened and so on. So I see cars doing crazy things, and so it's a shared responsibility that we're all having to take better measures and paying attention to what's happening. So with this additional funds, I also hope that we actually have mechanism. I spoke with the chair of the Works Committee a short time ago about the necessity of that, and she concurs and says something has to happen, and it's going to have to happen with respect to the PSAs to help people to be alert and be aware at all time, right in front of your face, about the challenges and the problem then, the impact on families. You know, I hear when people say to me, you know, this person, I knew him and he was riding his bike and he got killed. a gentleman recently, I don't know the name, but someone said, I knew him. He was a great guy, and all of a sudden we've now lost him, and it's a sad day for all of us, quite frankly. So we need to do more. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. It was to be a quick release, but I'm very glad we had the comments we did, and I'll just conclude, and I know I introduced the motion, but you know, this is a place where we have a platform to say something that is really important to say, and it's a slight variation on what some of the different councillors said. There was, and I said this at a press conference the other day, but I think it bears repeating over and over again, there was something that existed in this city and elsewhere too in past years, which I called the other day a social contract between people, who just said, without casting aspersions on whether it's drivers or cyclists or pedestrians doing things they shouldn't do, just said that we took the responsibility to look out for each other and to look after each other and to care for each other, whether we were driving a car, especially because they are 2 tons of steel, but also if you were walking or on a bicycle. And for some reason, and a big curse of that, I think, is distracted driving, a huge curse of that, huge. It's almost a crisis that people are still doing it, even though the law is very clear and it's so negligent and it's so damaging potentially. But there are other considerations as well that have been mentioned here. And I just would hope that people could just focus, we can do all these improvements, as has been said, and we will invest this extra money, and I thank you for what looks like your anticipated support. But if people don't decide they're going to return to a day when they care for each other and look out for each other and don't get into this who has what right against who, but they do sensible things that do respect rights and rules, but also just respect sensibility and sensitivity to each other, then it will be very hard for us to make much progress, notwithstanding the efforts of Councillor Robinson and the staff of our city. So let's take today with the investment that's going to be approved, I think, and then ultimately on to council as an invitation for people to change their own behavior, and that applies to everybody. Everybody, but it's especially important for drivers because they are in trucks and cars, you know, better protected than others, but it's everybody without exception. So if we're ready to call the question on what was a short, quick release, but nonetheless we got the item, I think, done. May I call the question then on the amendment to add the provision for the $13 million? All in favor? Recorded vote. Okay.
All those in favor of motion number 1? Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Balau, Councillor Burnside, Councillor Crawford, Councillor McMahon, Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong, Mayor Tory, Councillor Palacio, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Shiner, and Councillor Thompson. All those opposed? The motion carries unanimously.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm sorry, item is amended. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Yes.
I held number 21. I can let it go.
Councillor Ainsley is releasing 35.21, which is open data review process for commercially, confidentially, and proprietary interests. Are there any questions of staff? Anyone wishing to speak? Otherwise, I can call the question to adopt the recommendation to receive the report. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. And then, I'm not trying to hold up the deputant on 35.6, but I was just making sure we clean off. I think we've cleaned off everything that we can that by way of quick items. So then it would bring us to 35.6, which is the demonstration, the item on status update administrative inquiry on hate-sponsored rallies. And we had a deputation there of Mr. Mostyn. Is Mr. Mostyn still here? There he is. Mr. Mostyn, please come forward, and thank you for your patience. You're most welcome here, and as you know, you have 5 minutes, and there may be some questions.
Thank you very much, Mayor Tory, and thank you as well for your strong words of support to both B'nai B'rith and the Jewish community. Speaking out against hate in the City of Toronto, it really is greatly appreciated. And I'd also like to thank Councillor James Pasternak, who has been a long-standing leader in advocacy against this particular issue, hate rallies in the City of Toronto, and in particular Al-Quds Day. I am the CEO of B'nai B'rith Canada. Since 1875, we have represented the grassroots Jewish community in Canada. We have been a leader in combating anti-Semitism. For the past 36 years, we have been compiling our own report about anti-Semitism in Canada. And we have been at the forefront against Al-Quds Day as well for many years. This item is dealing with hate-sponsored rallies such as Al-Quds Day. The original motion, I just want to note, just for the record, is dealing with all hate rallies in the City of Toronto. Al-Quds Day is inspired by terror, by the terrorist regime of Iran. It was established by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. And make no mistake, this is a hate rally. This is a hate rally. And there is evidence of this year over year over year around the world, but also in the city of Toronto. This past year, there was a call by an individual for the eradication of Israelis, individuals. There were Hezbollah flags on the streets this year as in years past. There were expressions of support on the streets of Toronto for Hezbollah. Hezbollah not being a political organization, but a listed terrorist organization, which has a history of murdering individuals, Jews and others, around the world. In previous years, they brought in a Holocaust denier as a speaker of this rally, just to further indicate the anti-Semitic nature of this event. Not that there's not enough Holocaust deniers, unfortunately, in Canada, but one was brought in from the United States to speak. There was music at last year's event, playing from the speakers by the organizers. It was referring to stabbings, cutting off of heads, blowing up of buses, i.e., murder of Jews. So, again, it's not about Israel at this event. Very much the perception of the Jewish community is this is about Jews, and this is how it is felt by the Jewish community of Toronto. B'nai B'rith did file a criminal complaint with police based on what we saw with video evidence this year. There were children, again, attending this year's event and witnessing all of this, which is highly inappropriate, I would suggest. But it happens, again, year after year. And city resources are used. Permits could be potentially applied for. Our understanding is that they were not. Unlike many other, perhaps unsanctioned rallies that are taking place on City of Toronto, there was marching down the streets, University Avenue, just close by to here, from Queen's Park down to the U.S. Consulate. So we're talking about diversion of TTC buses, garbage disposal, a heck of a lot of police officers that are there on the streets, and buses bringing people in, I would estimate between 80 to 90% who are not residents of Toronto, coming from other municipalities surrounding the city. So there's a tremendous use of resources. And at the same time, the Jewish community, by Toronto police stats, are the most targeted religious group in the City of Toronto once again, and this has been the case for many years. Our own audit of anti-Semitic incidents has indicated a long-standing trend and increase in anti-Semitism all the way across Canada. So this is very disturbing. And what B'nai B'rith finds perhaps even just as disturbing, I should say, is with respect to the status update, city staff were asked to consult with a wide range of stakeholders and to report back for this year. In this report, it said that that was simply not possible because of the large number of stakeholders and complexities of the issues. They then, by the end of the report, state that on the same timeline that they were originally asked to provide this report for this year, they can meet it for next year, asking for Q2 of the next council. So it sounds to me, and also it says very clearly, it's listed who they're supposed to be meeting with, stakeholder groups like the Jewish community in Toronto, which were not. However, city staff had time yesterday to write me a 2-page letter, but not enough time to pick up the telephone in an entire year. An entire year. According to this own timeline, it would be 3 years, last year's Al-Quds Day, this year's Al-Quds Day, next year's Al-Quds Day, without even a report talking about the seriousness of this nature and how do we deal with it. So respectfully, it doesn't appear that anything was done. And this is highly, highly disappointing, not just by the Jewish community here, but I'm sure by anybody who cares about the use and misuse of fiscal resources in the City of Toronto and cares about hate.
Just at the 6-minute mark.
Oh, sure. So I'll wrap up very quickly. So it was possible, we believe it was possible, but for whatever reason, city staff chose not to act. In conclusion, those who play by the rules, those who do follow city permits, can spend tens, sometimes $100,000s of dollars, and these people should not be put at a disadvantage by those who are against not following by the rules. We need deterrence. We need mechanisms to prevent hate in the city. We have anti-hate policies. We need to ensure that those are followed by everyone. And, and although Jews may be targeted in these events, we want to ensure that nobody gets targeted. Blacks shouldn't be targeted, LGBT community shouldn't be targeted, nobody should be targeted. But it's happening over and over again, and we need to put a stop to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mostyn, and I'm sure that some other comments may come out in questions, and so are there questions of the Deputant, Councillor Pasternak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Michael, for coming down, and thank you for your good work at B'nai B'rith. It seems to me that over the years, this started out at Queen's Park, and when they were finally educated on how pretty offensive this event is, they banned them from Queen's Park. But the fact that they're coming from other municipalities, are they not holding it in these other municipalities because they are banned from there, or they're shamed into leaving? They seem to come down here to create the most havoc. And then now the onus is on us to make sure they don't congregate here.
Well, thank you, Councillor Pasternak. I think you'd have to ask the other municipalities about that. In our own discussions with other municipalities, we know that certain groups have been told they are not welcome on their own municipal properties because of repeated violations of various natures, including expressions of hate. So that is a possibility. But certainly it points to the fact that, again, these are not residents of the city. The City of Toronto, this is the capital of our province. Certainly, they could get much more media coverage, closing down streets in the City of Toronto. So I would think for various reasons they want to do it here, and unfortunately not playing by the rules.
Now, you mentioned in passing that that they don't pay any fees. They obviously don't sign our anti-discrimination policy disclaimer because they certainly wouldn't qualify for any space. While many other legitimate peaceful groups pay enormous fees, whether it be road closure fees, TTC rerouting fees, solid waste fees, and so forth, in the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. This group, to the best of our knowledge, doesn't pay a dime. Yet blocks one of the main arterial roads in the City of Toronto. What signal does that send to our other peaceful groups and cultural groups that want to have cultural festivals and street festivals?
First of all, it's a very negative group. It's a negative signal. It's a negative signal as well to many expatriates who are Iranian in origin, who are targeted themselves by the Iranian regime, even outside of Iran. And we have conversations with individuals like that on a regular basis. There are many groups that are offended by this, that are targeted by this. You're right. Cities are spaces for celebrations of all of us. They're not places that we should be singling out identifiable groups for hatred.
Now, I guess this has been translated, but they sing a song together with their children, which has phrases such as "slaughter them in Etzion," which I assume is an Israeli town, and "stab them in Lod and Hasharon," which are also Israeli towns. And then it goes, I don't want to repeat some of the lyrics in this song. They sing this at the beginning of their event. Is that some kind of anthem, or?
Well, that's happened before, and that's part of the problem. That's why we actually believe this is a broader issue. We believe at B'nai B'rith that issues of hate like this are actually broader national security issues, because we're all concerned about radicalization. Exposing children to messaging like that is absolutely wrong, and one could expect only leading to bad things as they grow older.
One final question. What does that say about the city of Toronto, if we were to allow this to continue year after year? What does that say about us as a city?
I think that over time, and we've warned about this before, we've seen violent expressions at events like this in other cities in the past. I think that's inevitable if this is allowed to continue over time. I think the message that will be sent out is that it's okay to target individual communities, and that I think other communities will be targeted after us. It never starts or ends with the Jews. That's the historical experience. And so we need to put a stop to this.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other questions of the deputant? I just have a couple if I could, Mr. Marston. First of all, just on the, I will tell you that I'm not satisfied either with the content of this report, and I will undertake to you here, as I did on the telephone, that because you pointed out to me and I didn't know until you did, that you hadn't been consulted as part of even the lead up to this report. I think we have to do more and better than that, and I think we will. I think there's also, and I'm going to move a motion that has to do with measures that can be taken to deal with some of these protests that feature hate speech, and I think Councillor Pasternak has as well, and we'll have to make sure, if we can, the time frame is collapsed so that we can have that report back well in time to look at what effect the results of it could have on any plans they have for next year. But I just want to sort of find out what what would be a minimum commitment we can make in terms of consultation, just to make sure that we don't make the same mistake twice.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that. I think at a minimum, we should try and, as you said, close the timelines to ensure that this report comes out before this day happens next year. Our understanding is it should be happening approximately the first week of June. So if that's the case, the report would need to come out prior to that, so that, and also giving time, obviously, for everybody to evaluate that report and take any recommendations into account. And
my motion will concern, in addition to Councillor Pasternak's, the means the city has at its disposal to address protests featuring hate, and there's no reason it can't go back, because we look at, for example, the possible recovery of costs. It can't go back and look at ones that took place in 2018 already. But I assume you think that would be helpful to look at these means for unpermitted, because they're unpermitted, as has been discussed here. I presume you think it would be helpful where there are instances where people don't ask for a permit specifically, that we would find other means of perhaps dealing with them when they prove subsequently to put on a demonstration within the context of free speech, but at the same time featuring hate speech.
Absolutely. There are three streams, essentially, that can be dealt with this rally. The first is through policing, if there's a violation of the criminal law, and that's for the police. But then within the city's purview, there is the opportunity for cost recovery, as you mentioned, and ensuring that city bylaws and regulations are followed as they should be. And the other is there is an anti-hate policy in the city, and to ensure that that anyone that may go through a permitting process in the future is complying with that, and that there are repercussions should that not be followed.
Do you have any advice, last question from me, do you have any advice on, somebody subsequently is going to have to determine, which of these, and we have the police that go and monitor these things, and then they, I guess, make reference to the Attorney General's department with this material. Do you have any advice for us if we're sitting here trying to look at the issue of cost recovery, how we really deal with the most difficult of questions that exists in this domain we're talking about, which is, who decides what is hate speech from the standpoint of the city and actions it might undertake, for example, to recover costs? How do we get advice on that?
Sure. Well, the city doesn't need to determine the hate speech. The hate speech is for the police. The city needs to determine what violates your own code of conduct. You have a policy. Right. And you can, there's a wealth of evidence. B'nai B'rith would be happy to come in and share videos and witness accounts of what's taking place here. And then you need to go through and see all of this behavior that's taking place. Is this in violation of the city's policies, separate and apart from anything criminal in nature that might be taking place? And if it does, the city needs to make a commitment that that is not welcome in the city. When groups were trying to use public library space in the city made determinations that certain sorts of speech weren't appropriate. So there are mechanisms, there are examples from other cities, and B'nai B'rith would be happy to come in and consult and share some knowledge that we may have.
Well, that's part of the consultation we'll look forward to, and the library initiative was at my request, and they did respond by making some alteration to their policy, which was still allowing broad use of the library, but at the same time making sure that policies were complied with. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your patience.
Thank you very much.
So, do we have any, that's our deputation, do we have any questions of staff on this? Councillor Pasternak.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we've received some correspondence, I guess, from the interim city manager that that this is not tolerated on city property, and that the sequence of events is if public safety or if a rally incites hatred or violence against a group, these actions will not be tolerated. City security staff will call Toronto Police Service for assistance, investigation, and appropriate action. And then we received correspondence from Toronto Police Services that then they draft a report called the Toronto Police Service General Occurrence, and that goes to the Hate Crime Unit. Then this goes up to the Ministry of the Attorney General. Do we know whether any of that was done during the recent, I think, June 9th Al-Quds Day event?
I'd have to get specifics on that. I would assume they followed our policies. That's our standard practice, but I'd have to go back to the security staff for that particular day.
So we do have mechanisms to react to hateful incidents or, in some cases, inappropriate behavior on city property. I guess I was copied on an incident recently where a user of a recreational facility allegedly made a racial slur against a staff member, and this person was given a 1-year suspension from all, I believe, recreational facilities because there was a history there. We have that tool to ban people who are acting in a confrontational or violent or racist way on our property. We've also received a letter listing some of the organizers of the Al-Quds Day event, hate rally. Why aren't we issuing trespass orders or suspensions to them as well, considering they are acting in the same racially inappropriate way that this individual did in our recreation center?
So with regard to the recreation center, there was a history. It wasn't not like one occurrence. So there were steps that we followed, and we worked quite closely with legal and our human rights office to ensure that we were taking the appropriate steps. With regard to this, it's a sort of a complicated issue because we have to balance the rights that individuals have and organizations have under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we don't issue permits. We don't tolerate hate activity or violence. We try and do everything we can, but we can't stop people. My understanding working with legal is we can't stop people in advance from gathering. So we haven't issued a permit. If they come and gather in our square or on city property, we have to monitor the event. And if there's concerns with public safety or they exhibit activities that would spur hate or violence, then we start taking appropriate action.
So we touched on it when we were talking to the deputant that many groups, there's many marathons, there's street festivals, they take place across the city. It's one of the great things of our city that we celebrate our diversity, and yet it comes with fees, road closure fees, solid waste fees, paid duty fees. We're working now with Taste of Manila where the fees are so high they feel they may have to shut down. Why is it that some groups have to play by the rules and pay the fees and others can just block University Avenue and tie up dozens of police officers and city staff, and there's no repercussions?
Through the chair, where we charge the fees, it's when someone comes in to ask for a permit, we grant the permit, and they have to pay those fees. Where these Where a permit's requested and we've denied the permit, there's no fees. And where they just assemble and we don't know in advance, it's a little difficult for us to then charge fees. My understanding is we can't do it on one particular event. We'd have to work with, we have had discussions with legal, so there's some ramifications in terms of how we be able to implement such a fee. As I say, like, we did want to report back, but the issues that come up when we look at this this particular matter, and we want to be able to bring measures that council can actually adopt and staff can move forward with. It's a bit complicated, so we have to balance their legislative, the rights that they have to assemble under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms with, you know, our ability to try and prohibit things that we haven't permitted, that just, they come just without a permit, and then there's a number of divisions involved, so it's a little bit complicated, and that's why we need time, and there's lots of stakeholders. So we just want to do our due diligence so that when we come forward with measures, we're still abiding by our legislative requirements, but at the same time, we're taking proactive steps to try and stop or prevent these rallies or assemblies from taking place.
All right, looks like my time is up.
Yeah, that was your last question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are there other questions from Councillor Burnside?
Yeah, thanks. Very quickly, so I don't really understand. So if you can't prevent a group from gathering, is what you're saying, correct?
So if someone asks for a permit,
yeah,
we do not issue the permit, right? Unless it's a respectful assembly, they comply with all of our policies, including our anti-hate policy that we have here at the city, and they comply with all the legislation, both provincially and federally. If they comply, we can issue a permit. But these organizations, these groups they often don't ask for a permit, so they just assemble. And my understanding of the legislation and legal can augment, the public has a right to assemble in a...
Yeah, I mean, through you, Mr. Mayor, I think it's important to point out that we can't sort of lump all uses of city property together because, of course, street protest is a different animal. It has a historical basis as a means of expression, dissenting views that typically, I mean, some would say is frankly, it contradicts it to expect those people to have a permit or to pay costs. But that's the type of analysis that has to be applied given the location of the activity in question. So.
Okay, sorry, my question was more about the issuance of permits. So when someone comes in for a permit, you determine if this group promotes hate? Or you try to determine that?
We try and determine that, and they have to actually sign a declaration that they're going to abide by all the legislation and all of the city's policies, including the anti-hate policy.
The anti-which?
They'd have to sign that off. They'd have to comply. They have to sign a declaration that they are going to abide by all provincial and federal legislation and all of the city's policies.
Okay, so let's say, let me give you an example. Say a group is against gay marriage. What would happen then? That's not promoting hate, right? Or is it? Like, what is that line? I'm trying to understand what that line is.
What line would violate the hate policy?
Yeah.
Hate is defined in the criminal code, and that is essentially the definition that we use. So if an organization is opposed to gay marriage or something or the other, that would not necessarily, in my view, violate the hate policy.
Holocaust denier, would that, in your view? And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I guess I kind of am, right? Because it seems to be such a fine line, and I'm not sure what that line is. And I always get complaints in the office about various groups, and I'm trying to understand.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think that's why, from staff's perspective, we welcome the administrative inquiry and the opportunity, the direction to go and consult with constitutional experts and human rights experts and do a thorough review of the case law and figure out if there is more the city can be doing. I mean, the policy is the best that the city is what the city has currently, but we're certainly open to that input to say, is there more that the city can be doing? But we certainly do, the definition is the definition in the criminal code, and it is, I mean, you are correct, that the line of what is hate or not is difficult, so we look to the case law to help us assess that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Burnside. Councillor Robinson, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, you know, we saw some of the activity on social media, and my question would be, I saw some banners that I think a lot of people would, almost everybody would find unsettling, some of the language used in some of the photos that were on social media. So is there any way to, first of all, I don't think these these endeavors or these initiatives should be supported in any way, shape, or form or permitted, but when that does happen on site, on a city facility, at a city facility, is there not some way to deal with that in an immediate way when you're seeing this hate language on banners and, you know, that are tied to trees and other city infrastructure?
So my understanding is when we actually see those activities occurring, we will call in the police and we work with the police to break up or stop those particular events.
Does that happen, does that take place in an immediate fashion? Like how quickly could that be countered?
Through the chair, we do that pretty quickly, and our folks are trained to actually review that on an ongoing basis based on the specific issue at hand. So it's pretty quickly, and they have access to police as required.
And would you or your staff or police officers be allowed to take down some of these the signage, banners, and material with this hate language on it? Are you allowed to pull that down in a prompt fashion?
I believe that security team would not actually do that. To tell you the truth, that would be through a different process, but I could get back to you, Councillor, on the specifics.
So even though what I read, what I saw on social media, I wouldn't even repeat because it's so unsettling and disturbing. And so you're saying that those banners can't be pulled down?
We have done some of that in the past, depending on the situation.
So it's depending on the situation and the content, or?
Could be content.
Could be content related?
Could be.
I think there needs to be measures in place to strike that type of, you know, immediately strike that type of propaganda. I don't know what to label it, but it's, again, no one should be exposed to that.
Thanks, Councillor Robinson. Any other questions of staff? All right. Are there those wishing to speak then on this matter? Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Obviously, I share the disappointment that we're not ready today with the full report, but if staff feel they need more time to do a more thorough investigation, then we have to respect that. I do have a motion. We've received correspondence from Toronto Police Services that have advised us that when a hate crime is reported, a Toronto Police Service general occurrence is generated and the hate crime unit conducts an investigation. Once the evidence is gathered, the investigation justifies the laying of a criminal charge of willful promotion of hate. The complete investigative package is then submitted to the Ministry of the Attorney General for review and consideration. So what we want to find out is we want to find out whether Toronto Police Services boards, whether the Toronto Police Service general occurrence has been generated in response to events on June the 9th, 2018, and confirm that a hate crime unit is conducting an investigation, and requesting the Ministry of the Attorney General to conduct an expedited review of the hate crime unit investigation of Quds Day rally on Saturday, June the 9th, 2018. And we'd like the city manager or interim city manager to report back to the executive committee in the first quarter of 2019, not just with the response to these motions, and I believe the mayor has something coming as well, but also the original motions. And it's important to realize that the original motions ask staff to identify tools that we have to prevent this from occurring in the future. Hate rallies of all nature, whether they be white supremacist rallies, whether they be anti-Jew rallies, whether they be anti-gay rallies, determining what's hate and making sure that these rallies don't take place on city property. And there's a reason why they were marching down University Avenue in our great city, blocking traffic and singing songs that are calling for the stabbing of people in other countries and slaughter and so forth, is because other municipalities they're not protesting in other municipalities, either because they're forbidden from doing so or there are repercussions, or they find that Toronto is open for this kind of behavior. At the same time, after several years, Queen's Park, the Sergeant-at-Arms finally told them to get lost, to get off their property, and they weren't going to participate in any way in the South Lawn at Queen's Park. So they've been kicked off the Queen's Park property. They're not allowed to congregate there. They're obviously not going to participate in their home municipalities, and now all the eyes are on Toronto. And the question is, what kind of city do you want this to be? Do you want us to be known that we were going to tolerate this kind of hate, this kind of targeting of individual groups? And if we let this go on, I think the repercussions are going to be catastrophic. I think if this is allowed to go on, then it'll metastasize into targeted rallies for other groups. And I think the sad commentary is the red lines of a generation ago are all being breached. You would have never seen this kind of behavior in such an open and blatant and derogatory fashion a generation ago. And we've got to recreate those red lines to make sure this doesn't happen. Now, we can't physically stop people from gathering, but there can be consequences afterwards for their actions. We do have the power to issue suspensions and trespass orders. We have, in the past, in various divisions, billed people back for services that have been delivered by the City of Toronto in certain circumstances, and that is really the way to stop it. Trespass orders, hate charges, and of course, making sure that there's a financial penalty to pay for running a hate rally in our good city. So I appreciate your support on this motion, and I look forward to the final report from staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pasternak. Others to speak? If not, then I will just speak, and I have a motion, Madam Clerk. If we could just put that up, and it really just follows along something that I had commented on last week, and also follows along some of the comments of Councillor Pasternak to add to this report the matter of the means at the city's disposal to address protests featuring hate speech, the means at our disposal, including possible recovery of costs. Because I'm not myself familiar with any example where we did bill back, but if there is a precedent, then obviously that would be helpful, and then I think we should look beyond the precedent to see what we can do in instances where we have determined that hate speech has taken place and deal with it accordingly. And I think that really speaks to one of the issues that's complex about this, in that normally if there was something taking place that was contrary to the criminal code, what you'd have is a police officer actually laying a charge. In this case, what happens, as we saw in Councillor Pasternak's motion, is that it gets referred to the Ministry of the Attorney General, the fact there has been hate speech allegedly take place, and they then reach a determination as to whether this will lead to, I guess, in effect, what I would call an aggravation of a criminal charge, but there's a sort of an intermediate step that often isn't involved with other criminal charges. And so we're left in a situation where in any given instance of a protest like this, it's not like the police could go right then and there that day and lay a hate speech charge. That's just the way the system is set up. And so I think it does require of us looking for other means to register our rejection of this on, and again, there's a distinction, I think, here between the use of city public spaces like Nathan Phillips Square, because the analogy was given of the Parliament buildings or the Queen's Park Parliament buildings. They simply said what we would say, which is you can't use the square, you can't use Dundas Square, you will not get a permit for that because they likely would not comply with our existing anti-discrimination and anti-hate policies. But the use of the streets, as our city solicitor was telling us, is a different story. And one of the reasons I'm hopeful that this report, and I am a bit disappointed that in the time between when it was asked for and when we received this kind of placeholder, is all I could call it, that we haven't made more progress on looking at what I admit are very complex issues, very complex in terms of the intersection between free speech, hate speech, the government's role in determining that, the government's role in sanctioning people as distinct from the court process. So they're complex issues, but the sooner we start to really grapple with them in terms of both the legal issues and the practical abilities the city would have to do anything about it, the better we'll know the answers to those questions and can actually then deal with them accordingly. But I think the bottom line is we have to express our outright rejection of this. I will just say one other thing I tried to do that I hope might be of a small help, and I don't really know what communication takes place and what control they have over it either, but I met very recently with a group of imams from the GTA and just said to them, in response to a question they asked me about how they could help to help build a better city, and it was a very genuinely asked question. I said one of the things I mentioned to them was that hopefully they could first of all, stand up and say when these things happen that they reject this kind of speech, because I think they do, in fact, I know they do, as a rejection of what they're all about and what their faith is all about. Those people do not speak for them or stand for them in any way. And secondly, to even actively help to discourage these kinds of things from happening. And I think they received that request very positively, because they understood that it was not, it was a very bad reflection on their faith, and on the sort of honest way in which their faith should be represented, and that it was very much not in the interest of trying to build the kind of city we're trying to build, that hate speech, there is no place for it, no matter who it applies to, but in particular the instance that I raised with them. So I think those are all things we can all work on together, but this report I think will be an instrumental report in helping us to determine really what we can do as a city, sort of in a way separate and apart from the Ministry of the Attorney General process that can be quite time consuming. So I think we're ready to deal with the motions, if there's no other speakers. Motion, is Councillor Pasternak's motion first up? So we have Councillor Pasternak's motion, and I'll call the question. Are all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Then my motion to amend the item, motion 2, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. The item as amended. Sorry? Don't need it because we're just receiving the report. Okay, that's good. Thank you very much, and thank you again to Mr. Mostyn for your patience and for your contributions today. Okay. We're going to move next, the clerk tells me, to 35.37, and I'll just flip back there. And that is the Transportation Services 2018 Capital Budget Adjustments, and that is, we've got a deputation from Mr. Hamish Wilson. Sorry, I called Mr. Hamish Wilson's name, and I didn't. Surprisingly, he's always here when he lists to be here, but he appears not to be here. So if that's the case, I'll just ask. This was on the Transportation Services 2018 Capital Budget Adjustments. I'll ask if there are any questions of staff. Are there any members of council, members of the committee wishing to make remarks? If not, then we'll move to the recommendation, which was to adopt the recommendations that were coming from the Budget Committee. And those have been moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favor, opposed, carried. Now I want to deal with the agenda in order here. So the next thing, I just don't have that sheet.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So next was,
They all have
and those are all the other ones that are left to deal with then?
motions, all deputies.
So those are the only remaining items. Oh, fantastic. Then we have next item 35.40. I was just looking at it with incredulous eyes at the fact that there's only 5 items left, all of which have deputations. Item 35.40, capacity improvements on bus and subway services, and that had a deputation which was also Mr. Hamish Wilson, who I will call for one more time. Mr. Wilson, not here. All right then, on that matter, I would ask if there's any questions of staff. Are there any members of the committee wishing to make remarks on this matter, 35.40? If not, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the recommendation coming from The Budget Committee, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. 35.44, EX 35.44, Occupational Health and Safety Report, year-end 2017. Oh, I'm sorry, 42. We have EX 35.42, Create TO Procedures Bylaw. And we have a Mr. Johnny Dibb. It's held by, well, it's also held by Deputy Mayor Menon Wong. We have Mr. Johnny Dibb. Mr. Dibb, good afternoon. You wish to make a deputation on the Procedures Bylaw? All right, and is that's what you want to address yourself to, is the Procedures Bylaw?
Yes.
Okay. Please proceed.
Thought I was going to speak about
minutes.
200 Rockcliffe. Okay. In the Procedures Bylaw 28.1.c, it talks about one of the reasons why the meeting might happen not in public, and it talks about the provision, when the board is considering buying land. And I was wondering if that would extend to Build Toronto and TPLC, or if it's just about the Create TO board itself, and whether it's worth spelling that out in the bylaw, because all that Create TO talks about is buying and selling land. It would be awkward to misuse the 28.1.c to put things not in public that should be in public.
Can I just let you know, sir, there's an opportunity here for you to make comments, and I'll treat that as a rhetorical question, which I would then be happy to ask the staff on your behalf when we get to question time.
Yeah.
But, unfortunately, you can't ask us or ask the staff questions, but you've asked I'll call it a rhetorical question, which we can get an answer to. But I'll just say as well that Build Toronto and the Toronto Portlands Corporation have been, in effect, folded inside, and this is the first time this procedural bylaw would actually be approved, so it isn't in place yet. It's being considered here now, and so it wouldn't have been applicable to anything that took place in the past.
No, I'm not talking about the past. I'm talking about moving forward. To my understanding, Build Toronto will still exist as a corporation. No, okay, then I'm wrong. So then all I'm saying is I'm pointing out to councillors that there is 21.1.c talks about one of the, obviously for various reasons, boards have to not have their proceedings public in certain circumstances. And one of the circumstances that's talked about is when there's discussion about sale of land. And I'm wondering if this is talking about the sale of publicly owned land, or whether it's talking about land that the board itself will use. So for example, if a property has been declared surplus, is that already, does it never get discussed in public? Or is this talking about another specific thing? And what I'm saying is, do we need to spell that out in order to avoid moving items into private conversations where they should be public?
I will treat that as both a rhetorical question and a suggestion as to whether we need to make further provisions, and we'll make sure we ask the staff about that when you are completed your deputations and we move on to questions of staff.
Yes.
Do you have any other points you want to make?
I just want to complete my deputation by saying that I'm happy that the Create TO's sort of governance appears to be more democratic than the previous Build Toronto governance. For one, Create TO seems to be meeting in this very room, which has video recording, and I would also, it's outside of the bylaw per se, but I would suggest to councillors to make sure that these proceedings get posted on YouTube, just like the proceedings of any other committee. And I want to say that it is important for the agencies of the City of Toronto to be as accountable as possible to the public, same as the committees and the departments of the City of Toronto. And this is why I'm here to speak. And the background of me speaking is because my community was a victim to sort of the lack of democracy in the previous setting of the board of Build Toronto. We felt that we were not informed about the sale of public land, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be nice for other communities in the future to have all of the information that should be public made public to them. That's it.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate you. Any questions of the deputy? Thank you very much. Are there questions of staff? Councillor Menon-Wong?
Yeah, I have similar questions. That's why I held the item. So I spoke with Josie Sholey, who explained to me that Build Toronto and TPLC, they will still remain. So we'll have Build Toronto, TPLC, and Create TO. So I'm curious, so my understanding is Build Toronto and TPLC will be governed by the OBCA, and Create TO will be governed by this procedural bylaw. So I'm curious to know, especially with regard to the transparency issues that were raised, well, I'm curious to know why those entities still exist. If I suspect I know, but I'd like to hear. And then the other piece I'm curious about is, I know commercial transactions are confidential, the nature of them are confidential, but I am curious to know what is the difference in terms of accountability rules, in terms of, does the Freedom of Information rules apply to Build Toronto and TPLC? If not, what specific rules apply and who administers those rules? Because I think that, well, you still have Create TO. There is, I think there might be a suspicion that they might use those entities to arrange transactions that might stay out of, or do things that might stay out of the eye of the public, especially because different rules apply to one organization than another.
So that's a very long question, but I understood the gist of it, and I presume somebody's prepared to take a crack at that.
Mr. Chair, Steve Trumper, Head of Legal at Create TO. So let me try and unpack the councillor's question a little bit. To answer the most recent question you asked is, yes, both Build Toronto and TPLC are subject to MFIPA, and we regularly deal with MFIPA requirements as they are received by us. As you know, the three organizations share the same board of directors, but all employees now that were formerly with Build Toronto and TPLC are now employees of Create TO. From a governance perspective, the bylaw in front of you is to govern the procedures for Create TO, and we do have separate procedures for Build Toronto and TPLC. As a practical matter, we conduct our meetings in a very similar fashion. So we begin the meetings in a public session and then move in camera, typically to discuss specific land transactions, either purchases or dispositions, as permitted by Section 190 of the City of Toronto Act. I'm confident we have a strong governance foundation for all three organizations. Our main governance document, of course, is our Municipal Code chapter, which requires Create TO to operate in a very transparent manner as far as City Council goes.
Monitor in this, is there an open meeting monitor or secret meeting monitor? If a meeting is held improperly in the city, that you can go to somebody and say,
yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, there is an open meeting investigator.
Yes.
Who's been appointed.
Yes, and so so Create TO is subject to those type of, let's say, accountability provisions, right? Yes?
To be honest, I'm not sure whether the open meeting investigator's jurisdiction extends to those board meetings. I'd have to double check that.
So I'd be interested in that. Does it extend to Build and TPLC?
Well, it would extend to Create TO, I believe, but I don't think it.
No, but as I said, this would be an example where different rules would apply because it's under the OBCA.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. I'd have to check and get back to you on that.
Yeah, because I would like to have an understanding, maybe in a written form, of in terms of accountability, just a chart that says here are the accountability rules. This is what these organizations are required to conform to, and these are the ones that they're not required to conform to, just for the purposes of understanding, what these organizations can or can't do. Because I know from experience, once we approve these things, bringing them back to executive committee and council it never happens.
Any other comment in response to that All right. Any other questions, Deputy Mayor? No?
What about access for councillors, like, who want information? Because, you know, I know that sometimes especially ABCs and corporate entities, they have the capacity sometimes to say no, that we're not going to give you this information. And I've been in an arrangement under a different mayor where it was very, very difficult to get the disclosure of information, and they said, well, if you want that information, you have to go to council, which creates a whole level of difficulty, which that's why they gave you that answer. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of, is there a protocol for members of council wanting information or wanting to ask questions? Is it in Create TO in both those, and in both Build Toronto and the TPLC?
Mr. Chair, I've been with Build Toronto, now Create TO, for 7 years, and we have never, in my experience, ever denied a request for information by a councillor. We're trying to cooperate with councillors and provide them as much information as we possibly can.
All right.
And if I can just...
all right. Other questions of staff on the procedural bylaw? Well, we're going to apply the retiring council special agenda adjustment clause here.
I hope it extends for the rest of the month.
We'll see. Yeah.
Councillor,
well, he's not retiring, so he's not accepted from it. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
we could make a deal.
Councillor.
That's right. If you have an announcement, you could qualify for questions now. Go ahead, Councillor Davis. You go ahead.
Do a deal with Councillor Shiner.
That's a bit scary. Councillor Davis, go ahead.
Councillor Minnan-Wong's questions were in the direction I, too, was intending to go. We had the opportunity at TTC, for instance, we've had the experience at TTC where councillors were not able to attend in-camera sessions, and in the end we figured out a way, and the TTC has accommodated councillors. So I'm wondering, are councillors able to attend any of the in-camera sessions of Create TO? Because of course all of the real estate transactions before that, anything in camera, we were of course able to participate in that discussion. Are we able to attend?
Councillor, if we and I can honestly say we've never received a request for a councillor to come and sit in one of the board in-camera sessions, but if we did, and I'm sure that we would look on that very favorably, but there would be obligations of confidentiality, of course, associated with what was discussed at the meeting. I mean, after all, you are representatives of our sole shareholder, and you are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Any other questions of staff? I have one if there are no others. Could I just ask, I was just curious, and again, I take some personal pride in the creation of Create TO and the consolidation of our real estate efforts, and I was sort of the view, I thought that in effect, I realize this is not a proper phrase for a lawyer to use, but in effect, we had folded in Build and the Toronto Portlands Corporation, and that I just want to have some better idea of why they continue to exist. I assume it's because there are maybe matters of title or some such thing that require them to exist, but they are not going to in any way, and I want to receive a public assurance here on the record, they're not going to be in any way active. It sort of follows along with some of what Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong was asking. They're not going to be active corporations. They're not going to have staff. They're not going to have expenses. They're not going to have any legal role other than what they might have now as holding title, for example, where we can't easily transfer it or something like that, because the whole idea was that all of those corporations were to be have their operations folded into one strategic body that would do all of this work and many others besides. But I just wanted to get some clarification on why they continue to exist.
Thank you for the question. It's an important question. We kept them part intentionally because they do own significant numbers of assets, particularly TPLC down in the Portlands, and of course Build Toronto has a large real estate portfolio itself, and it's very important to keep those assets separate, particularly the Portlands assets, in a separate corporation. There were a number of legal complexities associated with actually merging the companies, so council in its wisdom fix that problem by creating a uniform board. All board members of CreateTO are cross-appointed to the boards of TPLC and BT. BT and TPLC have no employees and are not permitted under their shareholder direction to have employees. All the employees and all the strategic direction for the two companies come from CreateTO.
And I presume, if I can ask one more question, that I would never hear, as long as I'm here, and that may not be long, but as long as I'm here, I will never hear anybody say, well, the board of Build had a meeting, even though it is the same people, and it decided something can't happen, even though it's the same people from CreateTO. We will never hear that instance, like in other words, where, you know, that would be, to me, kind of a attempted bypass of the system, that anything that is of any substance whatsoever other than a pure legality, which may be required to, say, approve something that Build owns, but otherwise all the decisions that we made at CreateTO, and these are really just, I'll call it paper entities because they own certain things and require the separate board of directors and so on.
What I would say to that, we do have separate board meetings, Mr. Mayor. We have typically our rhythm is we have a CreateTO board meeting here in this committee room every other month, and then we have the corporate board meetings on a separate schedule. The corporate board meetings do make substantive decisions in connection with the assets that are held in the portfolio of those two companies. Anything that is of a broader strategic nature or anything to do with a city asset is decided at the CreateTO level.
But just to finish, I'm assuming what we will never see happen is that there will be a decision taken, even though I understand the decisions taken by, say, the Build board are substantive because they own a piece of land.
Correct.
Therefore, it's by definition a substantive decision. What we will never see is a Build board meeting take a decision that is inconsistent somehow with what CreateTO would have done. I realize it seems like a silly question because it's the same people, but that's one way in which somebody could use that existence of these different corporations to, you know, do something to get around the intention of this, which is to have CreateTO make the decisions and be the body that exists going forward, and not all these other companies. They really exist just because they have to, as opposed to having any meaningful role, meaningful meaning, you know, not just a legality, if you follow what I'm saying.
You have my assurance that as long as I'm in my role, that will never happen.
Thank you. Okay, that was questions of staff. Do we have any persons wishing to speak to the matter at all? Deputy Mayor Wong, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just speak. I'm not going to move a motion, but if staff can just provide me with something before council, just explaining in terms of the difference, in terms of the accountability and all the various accountability officers and provisions that are available, and if they can draw me a chart comparing BuildTO, TPLC, and CreateTO and what rules apply. And you can send it to the rest of council, but I'm just very interested in seeing that.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Anybody else? I'm just counting heads. Okay, anybody else? I think it's only 6. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't see Councillor Burnside sneaking in behind there. Okay, anybody else wishing to speak? Otherwise, I am ready to call the question on this, which is item 35.42, CreateTO Procedures Bylaw. All those in favor? Opposed? Carry. That brings us then to 35.44, Occupational Health and Safety Report, and that was being held for a deputation from Mr. Randall Pantzer. Mr. Pantzer here? All right, Mr. Pantzer doesn't seem to be here. Then are there any questions of staff? Anyone wishing to speak to the report? Otherwise, I'm prepared to receive a motion to adopt the recommendations coming from the Employee and Labor Relations Committee. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. That then brings us to 35.45, the annual Hate Bias Crime Statistical Report from the Toronto Police Service, and it was being held for a deputation from Mr. Waleed Kogali, who is still here. And so, Mr. Kurgalik, thank you for your patience, and you're up, 5 minutes.
Mayor Tory and members of the Executive Committee. So this issue is very important to me and to many members of the community that I advocate for. You know, the incidence of hate crime being on the rise is very troubling. I'm sure folks have gone through the report, but I would like to get you to focus on an aspect of the report that is lacking. So I'll speak to what's lacking. Specifically, victim support services. I will share a personal story, and hopefully you folks can connect with what I'm trying to say so you understand why it's important for that focus to be included in future reports. You know, I've been a victim of a hate crime incident, and one of the things that I found very troubling was, first of all, the response rate when it comes to members of law enforcement, you know, contacting me about the incident. Second piece was the lack of information shared with regards to victim support services that are supposed to be shared with all victims of hate crimes. That wasn't the case, and that's not been the case for many folks who have either reported incidents of hate or have no clue where to turn when it comes to incidents of hate. The last piece that I want to mention is specifically the deterrence that I personally experienced, where, you know, I was informed by members of law enforcement that, you know, this is going to result in the individual been, you know, put on a peace bond, asked not to connect with you, but that's basically it. You know, did you want to go through the court process and it eventually lead to that? And that's something that really concerned me, that, you know, it's the members of the judiciary, it's the Crown that determines that decision and shouldn't be made by anyone else. So this report, I've read it extensively, and what I found interesting was there was no focus on victim support services and the important role they play when it comes to supporting victims of hate, whatever form of hate. And the other piece is also with regards to understanding the problem itself, right, and how chronic it is. My personal experiences have led me to believe that there's a lot of people who are impacted by hate but are not reporting it. So we actually have an issue of underreporting of incidents. The last thing that I want to say is with regards to a campaign that the City of Toronto should think about collaborating with Toronto Police Services and other groups that are invested in making sure that we work collaboratively to reduce the incidence of hate in our city, so we could have a safe, inclusive, and equitable city. So if there are campaigns out there that are focused on such type of work, they're not very well known. You know, I'll appreciate members of council or the executive committee to elaborate on what those initiatives look like, so that we could act members of community organizations and very active members of our community to participate in such initiatives. So thank you.
Questions of the deputy? I just have one. I just want to make sure, I'm sure you're aware of the program we do have, which the city manager just confirmed is in the base budget. So it was initially kind of, I won't call it an experiment, but it was something we tried out. But it was called Toronto for All, and I thought they ran some fabulous, very stark kind of ads that were deliberately aimed at doing what you said, which is, you know, kind of reminding people of the fact there are still instances of discrimination and hatred that take place in the city, and kind of, you know, directing them away from that and consistent with our way of life. And they were sponsored by the city. Are you aware of that campaign?
So I've been made aware of that campaign, but it's about where those materials are found. They're not found on our university campuses. They're not found on, you know, community specifics. They're actual partners and allies that exist in our communities that we should be working with. So my point is, let's get that information out there, especially if it's been done, so that more people see it, so that more people can respond to it. But my other crucial point is with regards to victim support services and how there's not been a focus on that important office that provides very much needed resources to victims of hate crimes. And that's something that I hope the next report will reflect on, whether that office requires resources How is that office doing when it pertains to supporting victims of hate? Those are questions that I think we should have answered so we can have a better understanding of how big of an issue it is in our city.
I think your point about engaging some of these other people is very useful, and you can do that largely through social media at very little cost to us. So I think it's a very useful point. I thank you very much. Councillor Thompson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, through you. You mentioned, sir, in your remarks with respect to the underreporting of the hate crimes. I'm just wondering if you had some thoughts and some ideas in terms of ways and means we could ensure that people are able to report, and maybe making it easier. Is it more complicated? Are people just simply not being bothered? For example, you talk a little bit about law enforcement in terms of responding to that. Does that discourage people, and what your thoughts in terms of what we could do?
Thank you for asking that question, Councillor Thompson. With my personal experiences, it's kind of discouraging, and I'll tell you why. I'm a person of privilege. You know, when that happened, I had the day off. I just got back from vacation, and you know, something happened to a person behind me, and they basically were in shock but quiet, and this was part of the incident. I'm not going to get into details, but I actually had the time to follow through with the complaint. I had the time to follow up with the judicial process when it comes to how it was adjudicated. Not many other folks can do that. The other thing is also language barriers. You know, for example, there was the last incident of hate crime that happened in my community was I was on my way to work, and two young, brave women were trying to stop a potential violent interaction between a woman who spoke English as a second language and a person yelling profanities at her, some very racist and, you know, how do I say, had a religious bias, but the person ran off. And the person who's supposed to initiate the complaint is the victim. But that's not necessarily the case. Other witnesses, other people can also initiate a complaint. So it's also a lack of understanding of what, you know, being a good bystander means, not just being a bystander and ignoring the incident altogether. So I think it's lack of awareness and education, but also support services. I feel like if there was more awareness about the victim support services that exist, there'd be more people feeling courageous to make those interventions happen. And I also think it's important for residents to work with community organizations that invested in safety and combating bias, combating hate. And we do have organizations that do that type of work, but I just don't think there's enough coordination and there isn't much awareness. And I hope this conversation will start that important work so that we could actually get to the bottom of the reasons as to why these incidents are continuing to increase and increase substantially in the last report.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other questions for this deputy? Well, thank you very much. Very useful. Appreciate
Thank you.
Emily Daigle, who we know very well, has just arrived, and we said we would hear her deputation on this. And can you make your way with the table okay there, Emily? Thank you very much.
Sorry for taking a moment, but I need to make it a little bit accessible. Hey, everyone. Oh, boy, 2 microphones, stereo sound. Okay. So I'm going to be very quick and to the point. Hate crimes are not just about color, creed, sexual orientation, male, female. As Stevie Wonder would say, we're so caught up in our isms, we have no time for one love. We have no time for love in our humanity, to speak kindly to one another. My husband and I have been attacked 3 times in the last 5 years. One of them was on the SRT. Coming in from Scarborough simply to go to a soup kitchen. Another time, I was attacked at Yonge and Bloor Station because I simply needed use to an elevator. Another time, I was walking along Carlton Street because there was no accessible streetcar at the time, and I was going to see my mother. It was 6:30 at night on a winter day and the sidewalk wasn't plowed very well. And someone was walking in front of me very slowly, and I had my lights on my chair, and I simply asked them quietly, I dinged my bell, and I said, "Excuse me, do you mind letting me go by?" They were an able-bodied person. Next thing I know, something hit me very hard in the side of my head. The person had swung on me with some kind of racket and swung on me again in my arm as hard as they could. I had a mark on my right arm for 2 months. In fact, it caused a blood blister in my arm. A streetcar driver saw it happen and called the police, but TTC told him to continue on. The police never came. I went to my mom's. Thank the Lord I made it to my mom's that night. The police showed up 2 hours later. Nothing was ever done because I'm legally blind. I couldn't describe the person and what they looked like. I said how tall they were. They had an somewhat off-white jacket and dark pants and a baseball cap. Nothing ever got done. My husband and I getting attacked on the SRT. Nothing got done. The police and the TTC constables fought forever about it. Nothing was ever done except I got a good friendship. A very nice man named Alex Fundek. He's a constable with the TTC, and he means the world to me because he's the only one who cared. I've been attacked a few other times. One of the ones was leaving City Hall here. 10:30 at night after a late meeting. As a person with a disability in a wheelchair, I'm not allowed to have lights by the Ontario government, but people with scooters who can still walk do. And it was before I had the new lighting on my chair that I paid for out of pocket. And I was hit. I don't even remember what I was hit with. I've been hit and punched and kicked so many times using transit, getting around in Scarborough, SRT train. The police don't take people with disabilities seriously. The Victim Services Unit tried sending me to a counselor in Mississauga whose office was inaccessible after the SRT attack. My husband has never been the same since that attack. He was learning how to get around. He was doing really well. He's legally blind, and ever since that attack, his anxiety and his PTSD from his life has ramped up so much. He lays in bed every day playing on his phone and watching YouTube, too scared to go out on his own. It destroyed all his independence. You think anyone was there to help him? No one. Yet nothing was done because we're white. Nothing was done because we're disabled. So is that not a hate crime to attack somebody with disabilities? Are we not as much as importance as people of color and people of different creeds? Hate crimes come in all forms and shapes. It's one reason why I left Scarborough, an area I wonderfully love, Ward 38 and Ward 43, especially 43. I miss that ward like crazy every day. I'm afraid to ride the trails after being attacked twice by cyclists. I ask you to make it a vital, important thing. Hate crimes aren't about color all the time. They're not about what you wear all the time. As a person in a wheelchair, I won't even use my white cane because I'm afraid of that being more of a symbol of my disability and people attacking me because of that. This city is a scary place. And you know what? Unless we start treating each other as one, unless we start being colorblind, and as Stevie Wonder would say, stop living on our isms, we're not going to become a strong community. Hate crimes don't just affect one community or two communities. I ask you to include people with disabilities, because right now, we're not included. and yet nothing can be done. My body can be taken to the hospital, but they leave my $32,000 wheelchair. How's that fair? Thank you.
Emily, thank you very much. And there were questions of the deputy. I'm just looking because couldn't find in my own. Thank you. Couldn't find in my own binder the report because I was just. It's a report that actually, as you know, came to the Police Services Board.
I've read it like 6 times.
And we just have the executive summary. Oh no, it has here. Yeah. Because I seem to recall that there was actually a category, but there's no category in the statistical tables for disabled persons and hate crimes against them. Oh, it says here, it says mental or physical disability is under the criminal code. I was pretty sure, because it just doesn't have all the tables here from the report which I've seen previously, that it did include actually, at least statistics. And I realize it doesn't speak to your point about whether anything's done about it, but I think it does include statistics on those who are reported to the police.
Statistics are one thing.
Yep.
But when you report it and nothing's done and you get no closure, and you're treated like you're not worth their time.
Well, I will take that back to the Police Service Board, because I think you're right. It's a matter of recording and reporting, that's fine, but then if nothing's done, either before, during, or after, it has a whole different...
Many people with disabilities won't report it. They're too afraid to. They're too sick and tired of being written off.
Okay. Are there other questions of the deputy? Well, Emily, thank you very much for being with us today. Much appreciated. Are there questions of staff on this? Are there anyone wishing to speak? I'll just say a word before we call the question. I think the point that is made, this report at the police service is meant to really monitor, the number of cases that are reported, and it doesn't speak to the question that Ms. Daigle raised about what happens after that. But I think even if you look at the report, and again, the tables aren't in the version that's in the city manager's binder, and I've read it when it was at the police board. The trend this year, and I just think I remark on it in particular, following on the comments that we had earlier on about the Al Quds rally and other things that we hear and know about. The trend line this past year, and the thing moves around a bit, was up a bit in terms of the overall levels of hate crimes, and that's something that in this city in particular, any city, but in this city we should worry about. And I think the report that we asked for today in some detail on the one instance of a protest and how we might deal with it was one way of sort of going further than what it seems like might happen when these cases are reported. But I think probably the best thing we can do to follow up on these reports when we receive the statistics, and especially when we see the trend lines going the wrong way, is to look at other ways in which we can make sure they're being reported, they're being acted upon when they are being reported, and so on. So I think it's just that's why these reports come here, so that we can see what they have to say, even though it's a report in this case that went to the police board. So are there any other comments before we call the question? All right then, this is on the recommendation, which I believe I can just find it as to receive. To receive the report from the Police Services Board, recommended from the Police Services Board, and I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. I believe that completes our business, unless somebody tells me there's something I've missed, or unless there's somebody else wants to stay longer and take up other matters. 2 more hours? No, I think we'll give you the 2 hours to do other things for the benefit of the people of the City of Toronto, and we'll declare the meeting adjourned. And thanks very much to the staff, and thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.